when Tucker finally twisted my arm to get JJ Meets World started, because truth be told, Tucker, you're the driving force between JJ Meets World. It might be my name on it, but really you're the one who's doing the work, you're booking the guests, and you're the one who consistently took me out to dinner and said, we need to do this.
Well, I appreciate the kind words. I would say we are the yin to each other's yang. There is no JJ Meets World without JJ Gordon and the driving energy you put behind it. So I appreciate what you're saying. I have plenty of compliments I would like to feed back to you, but this could quickly turn into you kiss my butt, I kiss your butt kind of situation, you know?
Well, I wanted to really prime you because what I'm about to say is I went off and started another podcast that Tucker's not in.
How dare you?
But I had a lot of advice from Tucker, and good news, we're bringing this to the JJ Meets World umbrella. We've got a lot of other ideas. In fact, you've got a couple things that you're working on right now. The soups are simmering on the stove already for a lot of alternate projects we're doing. We're going to continue to do JJ Meets World and bring you interesting guests, but we also have these little side projects. And so one of these side projects involves previous guest Phil Godel. You've heard him in a lot of episodes. And Phil is an avid reader, and he is probably one of the nation's biggest Stephen King fans. Now, I've read a few Stephen King books, and I've seen a lot of Stephen King movies and the miniseries that accompany the television channels he's chosen to team up with over the years. And so we decided, wouldn't it be fun to have a podcast that breaks down Stephen King movies and then has an avid reader compare book to screen? So you are about to hear a brand new podcast that we're launching called Men Among Kings. Get it? You get it? Like king among men, but men among kings.
Yeah, and I hope this doesn't take any of the wind out of the sails of the podcast I was planning on making called Beer Steins with R.L. Stein, but I guess we'll see how yours goes first. And, I know there's a lot of crossover between King's books and the Goosebumps people, but this is fine. Now, I'm actually really excited about this. This has been a passion project of yours for a while now, and I'm just really excited that the JJ Meets World listening audience gets to kind of hear a new direction. We, like you said, we have fallen in love with the podcasting biz. People can expect 2 new episodes of JJ Meets World every week. And from time to time, people know we do Monday episodes and Friday episodes. So you can look forward to, from time to time, Friday JJ Meets World time slots will be where we start to debut some of our new work. And so this is where we're starting it off with. And I am pumped, dude.
All right. Now, you've listened to the intro for this episode. You're going to hear another intro immediately after this. And it's the intro Phil and I do, explaining what Men Among Kings is going to be, how it's going to feel, and what you're going to get out of it. And I got to tell you, listening audience, if you go out and rent one of these movies because you think, oh man, that breakdown of The Running Man, I haven't seen that since the 80s. I love that movie. Send us a note. Go to jjmeetsworld.com. You can find our contact info there. Engage with us on social media. And of course, we would appreciate it, as always, if you hit us up on Patreon. Every dollar means a great deal to us to keep these things going and to continue making new products. Plus, a review on iTunes, like Apple Podcasts, it means so much. So without further ado, now that this intro's done, please sit back and enjoy another intro. And then I swear we're getting into a great breakdown of a horrible Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. Hello, podcast listener, and welcome to Men Among Kings, a retrospective on Stephen King's film adaptations. I'm one of your hosts, JJ Gordon.
I'm Phil Godel, your other host.
So, Phil, why are we doing a podcast about Stephen King movies?
Well, I am an avid reader, and Stephen King is my favorite author. I've read almost every single thing that Stephen King has ever written. And I also love movies. And I always compare those novels to the movie, and sometimes they're great, sometimes they're bad, but it's always fun to talk about them with somebody else who has seen those or read those things.
And I love them. When you think about like the 1980s and you think of 80s horror, you've got the birth of the slasher flick, thanks to Wes Craven. But then you have all of these scary psychological thrillers that came out that are all Stephen King. I mean, I was born in 83, so by the time I was born, there, Creep Show and The Shining and Carrie, all pretty major hits.
Oh, yeah.
And then all of a sudden in 83, Cujo, The Dead Zone, Christine. Then 84, Children of the Corn, Firestarter. 85, Cat's Eye, Silver Bullet. 86, Maximum Overdrive. Then Stand By Me. Creep Show 2 is in 87 along with Running Man. And then Pet Sematary in 89. And it just gets further and further. People have won Academy Awards being in some of these pieces. Some have become cult classics. And I'm not just talking about the scary ones. You take like Shawshank Redemption. Mm-hmm. If that's on TV, I can't not watch it. And they usually air it back to back.
Yeah.
So I watch it twice.
You would be hard pressed to find somebody as prolific as Stephen King is to book and movies nowadays. Think of Michael Jordan. There was a time when Michael Jordan was like, this is the basketball player. Well, since Michael Jordan is retired and everything, there's other people that have come up that are, very high and prolific, but they're still not Michael Jordan. Stephen King everybody knows who Stephen King is, and or has been influenced by Stephen King. And Stephen King has his own influences as well that I've noticed, but everybody is familiar and or has seen something that Stephen King has done.
And born in 1947, King has almost 100 books under his belt.
And well more than that for short stories.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it just goes on and on. And so to me, it's not a surprise that he became as important in the film world as he was in the realm of books.
What's interesting is that they can also, with what they do for movies, you can create one full movie off of one of his books that are 200, 300, 400 pages long, but they also make full-length movies off of a 25-page short story.
Mm-hmm. Or
full movies.
You get things like miniseries.
Yeah.
And, at this point, Stephen King has created a universe.
Absolutely. If anybody has seen or read or is a big fan of Stephen King, you've heard of The Dark Tower. Even if you just read a good chunk of his books, he references his other novels in those books, as in like everything is in the same world. So
is
exciting.
It Castle Rock? Is that the
Castle Rock was the show that came out, but that Castle Rock was the setting for the Dead Zone, for Cujo, for Needful Things, a plethora of short stories.
Do you think in something like take Game of Thrones where they've got Casterly Rock, do you think that that's like George R.R. Martin's wink towards Stephen King in a way? Because a lot of people do work in little tiny winks and nods to Stephen King. Like you said, he's inspired generations of screenwriters and directors. And so, of course, they'd want to pay homage to the creepiest dude ever. Mm-hmm.
In fact, that's in a way, those of you who are familiar with Stephen King know that he wrote under a pseudonym Richard Bachman for a while. The book Thinner, the big reveal, I should say, that made people go, hey, wait, is this Stephen King? Is in the book Thinner, he references, hey, it's not like this is a Stephen King novel in the book. And then people were like, hey, wait a second. Okay. Is this Stephen King? And yeah, he revealed it.
As we go forward with this podcast, we're going to choose individual projects. So you take something like It's had a mini series. It's had a major motion picture that's been split into two parts. But we're going to cover each of those individually.
Yeah. In fact, there's so many of his properties has been turned into sequels that are not based on his novels.
The Rage Carrie 2?
Yep. But also, many of them have been remade. And so
we'll talk about the first film version of Pet Sematary and then the updated version, the reboot of Pet Sematary.
I still got to buy that.
There's a lot of interesting stuff that we're going to cover through this, and we're going to do some due diligence and talk about the characters and some filming choices. We're going to talk about the fact that by this point, he's been through enough directors. It's not like a single director takes on all of Stephen King's work. It's a smattering across the board. You talk about from Rob Reiner to Frank Darabont to people who'd only directed music videos beforehand. It's a very interesting situation.
So many actors have done something for Stephen King.
So as we get into this, Phil's read a majority of the books.
Yeah, almost all of them. I
am definitely not going to catch up when it comes to reading the books, but there are a few out there. I've read Misery maybe 4 times. Nice. It's one of my favorites.
11/22/63 you've read. I borrowed that from you to read.
Yeah, that's a thick book.
It's a good one, though.
How many times have you read it?
3 times.
And it's like 1,200 pages.
The paperback copy that I have is 1,091 pages.
Oh.
And I've read it 3 times. Once when I was a teenager, once when I was a little bit older, and then once again when I was older still.
So Phil can give you an analysis from page to screen. I'll talk about things that I notice as far as being a young film lover and watching these movies on VHS and on cable and growing up with that and the influence it's had in popular culture.
Yeah.
It's no surprise that when Stephen King has a movie that really just captures the imagination, all of a sudden they go back to his, catalog and they're like, oh, well, what other Stephen King can we adapt now? What can we make happen?
Or they compare it to previous Stephen King things. I will completely admit I am not going to reread every single thing before we review the movie, but we will watch the movie before we will rewatch the movie before talking about it.
And I take notes.
Yes. So do I.
Oh,
and I do look up a summary because some of these books, it's been quite a while since I've read it. But like I've only read a lot of Stephen King books I've read multiple times, but there are some that I've only read once. I've only read The Dead Zone once, and that was the very first Stephen King book that I read when I was 14 years old.
Some critics have said that Stephen King doesn't really understand how to end a book, that he's got really great subject matter and 4/5 of the way through, all of a sudden it just changes and it's sort of like, this is the end, bump, bump, bump.
Yeah.
Or he drags out an ending too far where the story
trying to
is
wrap
done.
it all up.
Yeah, and it just keeps going and going and going. So I think that to me, one of the things about Stephen King is we were just chatting with another buddy of ours who said Mark Twain's got this famous quote where he says, great books are wine, my books are like water. Everyone has to drink water.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Stephen King books are not the perfect book out there, but they do exactly what you want. Yeah. It gets you sucked into a story. It introduces you to a world that doesn't exist, but is based on our reality.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the interesting elements that I think people can be drawn to, as well as the fact that, I mean, after you watch that first Pet Sematary movie, every time you hear a character from Maine talk, you sort of want to get into don't go down that road.
Yeah.
Come on, Dennis.
If you, he has a thing after each book, he like addresses the audience, kind of like an afterword. And he addresses his audience as constant reader because so many people are constant readers. And Stephen King really does his due diligence on research into a lot of the science and stuff, like, well, what would happen if this giant dome was put around a town? What would the pollution be like? What would, this, what would all these little things? So he really does a lot of due diligence in stuff. That being said, not everything is perfect. He does take liberties, and you'd be hard pressed to, you will probably never, if you're taking a college course on American literature, you'd probably never read a Stephen King book unless this is like 100 years in the future and we're looking back. But I have no doubt that there are classes out there in some colleges where it is focused on just Stephen King.
Oh, I'll bet you. And they'll probably use this podcast as part of their narrative structure.
Well, we can hope so.
The other thing I really like about Stephen King is at one point he probably didn't encounter a dog that was, had the devil's eyes, but I'm sure at one point in his life he was frightened by a dog. When you're walking by, that house where the dog runs up to the fence and it startles you, boom, inspiration for Cujo.
It's one of those things where it's like, but what if?
He also has an amazing way of writing about bullies.
Yeah.
You can obviously tell that Stephen King had been bullied in his life, and his love for that era of the early 1960s, late 1950s, when he would have just become a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the things that I think come out in his writing that are amazing. The want to get that beautiful old muscle car so that people didn't think of you as a nerd. Boom,
Yep.
Christine. Or what would happen if this lawnmower got a mind of its own? Maximum Overdrive.
Yeah.
There's so many of these things that are universally appealing to people, and I think that they find something, loss and grief with Pet Sematary.
Mm-hmm.
And what would you do to bring that person back if you were in the bargaining stages of grief?
Yeah.
He hits on so many points that people are going to identify with, and it's not like his books have this huge lofty ideal. They're simple concepts that he takes and he makes the characters so
Runs with it.
engrossing. So good.
You write what you know, which is kind of creepy if you think about that.
But the world's creepy. There's a lot of
is.
creepy stuff that happens.
Uh-huh.
Have you ever seen someone watch a spider for like more than 10 seconds and they
I have.
They get mystified by watching a spider?
Especially when it's like winding up a fly that you happen to catch and throw in the web.
Mm-hmm. He writes kids incredibly well. You think of things like Silver Bullet and Carrie.
Mm-hmm.
He understands. He's really dialed into that vulnerability of a child.
I know that there has been some criticism on him where it's like, oh, he doesn't write women super well. But his wife is an author as well, and she reads everything that he writes. It's like she's technically one of his editors in a way. And so I'd be hard-pressed to say that they are gross misrepresentations of women, but sometimes, you also got to just move the plot forward.
Stephen King also is known for the fact that he has a phenomenal deal for filmmakers who want to adapt his work.
Mm-hmm.
The story that I've always heard is any Stephen King book can be adapted for $1. That's what he charges. So if you're a student filmmaker and you want to get the rights to be able to do an adaptation of something, it costs $1 unless the rights, the film rights are solely owned by a movie studio. Once Stephen King's films began, once the adaptations began for Hollywood, it goes on and on and on and on and on. I think you're hard pressed to find like times where there's like a multi-year gap without, stuff. So like, for example, I'm looking at this. 76 to 80, that's one of the biggest gaps that you're going to find once they started adapting Stephen King books. But then you've got 82, 83, 84, 85, 86, 87, 89, 90, 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, 2001, 2003, 2004, 2007, 2009, 2013. So there you've got a 4-year gap as well. 2014, 2016, 2017, 2019. And I mean, in 2019 alone, you get Pet Sematary, It Chapter 2, In the Tall Grass, Dr. Sleep, and then a whole bunch of stuff that's...
I'm looking forward to Dr. Sleep.
Right? So at the time of this recording, that has not been released, so we'll get into that. And then even
when that book was coming out, it was very exciting.
Well, and that's only the major film adaptations.
Yeah.
We're not even talking about the television stuff. Oh, yeah. So everything from Salem's Lot to Tommyknockers, Langoliers, The Stand, these things all kind of fill in some of those year-long
and
gaps.
Not just the miniseries stuff, but actual television series stuff. Under the Dome was a 3-year. They had 3 seasons.
Mm-hmm. And Dead Zone that ran for a few years.
I have that entire series on DVD. Like the first couple seasons are great, and then it's like you're really trying to draw it out and trying to get those USA dollars.
Hopefully, by the time we get to the Dead Zone, I can improve my Christopher Walken impression.
Yeah,
because I think I do a pretty good job. Most of the time, it's a watch.
We'll let the people decide on that.
All right. So, folks, without further ado, we're going to let you get into Men Among Kings. Of course, we're parodying the King Among Men moniker from years ago and running with it. So I guess this is JJ. Enjoy Men Among Kings.
We'll see you soon. This is Phil.
Welcome to Men Among Kings, a podcast where we break down Stephen King's adaptations into film and television. I'm your host with the most, JJ Gordon.
I'm Phil Godel, your co-host.
Today we review The Running Man.
Indeed.
Easily one of the more ridiculous adaptations from Stephen King, although it's technically a Richard Bachman book.
Correct. Richard Bachman, if you are unfamiliar, which if you're listening to this, you probably aren't unfamiliar, but Richard Bachman was the pseudonym for Stephen King in his younger years. He was releasing books under his own name as well as under the name Richard Bachman.
And this is not the novel where they figured it out, right?
No, this is not.
So at the time of even making this movie, people still didn't know who Richard Bachman was.
No, they knew that Richard Bachman was Stephen King at the time of the movie.
Oh, but not with the book.
But in the movie itself, it does still say written by Richard Bachman. It's kind of like a tilt to the hat.
Ooh, okay. See, I like stuff like that. Phil, have you read this book?
I have. It's been a while since I read it, though.
And what did you think of the book?
The book was good. It is significantly different than the movie, though.
Okay. Like big, huge changes or just small changes?
Big, huge changes. It's less plot similar and more theme similar.
So 1987 is the release date of I guess it's an action film, but it's probably also sci-fi because it's set in the future.
Yes, action
Would
sci-fi.
Would you say then?
And Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Arnold Schwarzenegger. And, of course, this is a big time in Arnold's career. You even get an I'll Be Back in The Running Man. The movie itself is directed by Paul Michael Glazer, who is really known for doing TV stuff, mostly, like Starsky and Hutch. I do not think that Schwarzenegger was very excited about working with someone who had come from TV. But it is a perfect choice when you think about the fact that this movie's about a TV show.
Yeah.
So he's bringing that mentality of what it's like to film in front of a live studio audience and making it a part of what he's doing here.
Yeah.
So, Phil, give us a plot summary so people know what happened in The Running Man.
All right.
Spoiler alert.
Get this. In 2017... after a worldwide economic collapse, the United States has become a totalitarian police state, censoring all cultural activity. Government pacifies the populace by broadcasting game shows where convicted criminals fight for their lives, including the gladiator-style The Running Man, hosted by the ruthless Damon Killian, where runners attempt to evade stalkers and near certain death around a large arena for a chance to be pardoned by the state. By 2019, technically our current year, Ben Richards, a police helicopter pilot framed for a massacre during a food riot in Bakersfield, California, escapes from a labor camp with two resistance fighters, Harold Weiss and William Laughlin, and find refuge at a resistance camp headed by their leader, Mick. Instead of joining the resistance, Richard seeks shelter at his brother's apartment. He finds Amber Mendez, a composer for ICS, the network that broadcasts The Running Man, living there instead. Richards asks Mendez about the whereabouts of his brother, and she says that he was taken for re-education. Richard kidnaps Amber, takes her hostage, tries to flee to Hawaii, but she alerts airport security, and Richards is captured, taken to ICS. There, Killian coerces him for participating in The Running Man in exchange for Laughlin and Weiss's safety. Ben learns that Killian has enrolled them as runners anyway and swears revenge, which Killian brushes off. As the game begins, Richards and his friends are attacked by the first stalker, Sub-Zero, but they fight back. Richards kills Sub-Zero, the first time a stalker has ever died on the show. Laughlin and Weiss search for the network's uplink facilities, which they realize are in the game zone. Amber sees a falsified news report on Richards' capture, and now suspicious does some investigating. After learning that footage of the massacre was doctored to incriminate Richards, she is captured and sent into the game zone. The runners split up, each pair pursued by a different stalker. Buzzsaw mortally wounds Laughlin, but is killed by Richards, Weiss and Amber locate the uplink and learn the access code, but Dynamo finds them and electrocutes Weiss. Amber's screams leads Richards to her, and as the two evade Dynamo, the stalker's buggy flips, trapping him inside. Refusing to kill a helpless opponent, Richards leaves Dynamo alive to jeers from the audience. He and Amber then return to Laughlin, who, before dying, reveals that the Resistance has a hideout within the game zone. Back at ICS, Killian sees Richards' popularity growing, with viewers betting on him instead of the stalkers. Off camera, Killian tries to offer Richards a job as a stalker, but when Richards refuses, Killian sends in the next stalker, Fireball. Fireball chases them into an abandoned factory where Amber discovers the decomposing corpses of the previous season's winners, realizing that they were killed by Fireball and their victory was faked. Fireball goes after Amber, but Richards rescues her and kills him. Frustrated and running out of options, Killian seeks Captain Freedom, a retired stalker, to kill them. However, when Freedom refuses, the network creates digital body doubles of Freedom, Richards, and Amber, which are then used to fake Richards and Amber's death on screen. In the game zone, Richards and Amber are found by Mick and taken to the Resistance's hideout, where they learn of their deaths. Using the access codes, the rebels get into ICS's control room, broadcasting footage that exonerates Richards and reveals the truth about the game's previous winners. As Richards heads to the main studio floor, shocking the audience who has watched him supposedly die, Amber fights and kills Dynamo, the last remaining stalker. Richards then confronts Killian after having dealt with security who tried to kill him, and the audience to cover up Let me say that again. Richards confronts Killian after having dealt with security, who tried to kill him, and the audience to cover up everything, not knowing it was being broadcast. Killian begs for his life, saying he created the show to appease the U.S. love of reality television and violence. In response, Richards decides to give the audience what they want by sending Killian to the game zone in a rocket sled. The sled hits a billboard bearing Killian's likeness and explodes, killing Killian to the delight of the audience. Richards and Amber kiss and then walk out of the studio together.
Well, it's an interesting story, and it's got a lot of potential. My initial feel on The Running Man is I don't get attached to any of the characters. Even Schwarzenegger's character, I don't really feel attached to him at all.
It's very generic, really. If you look at it, especially compared to Arnold Schwarzenegger's other films, it's a lot of the same of what was just popular in that day. It was legitimately, hey, we want another Arnold Schwarzenegger action movie, and here's one.
Right. They do such a good job in Total Recall, building up, his character is a husband, and he's this guy who yearns for something else. In this, he just doesn't want to open fire on a bunch of people, and so you're supposed to take that he's a good person, and yet he will just completely kill left, right, up, and down. Even when he's in the escape sequence, he really doesn't care much about everybody else. He just wants to escape.
Yeah.
The cast itself, so you have Schwarzenegger, who's the big draw on this. His counterpart, Richard Dawson, the longtime host of Family Feud, amazing casting choice.
Oh, yeah.
Perfect casting choice.
Because this is in the 80s when he was well-known.
Incredibly well-known. And he had a reputation for being just a jerk to subordinates. And so they said, this Killian character is very close to who Richard Dawson really is. And he's also one of those people who has wealth and power, but he really does feel like he's giving the people what they want. Yeah. He feels like he's doing like a real service. He's not just here to say like, oh, I'm just filling time between car commercials.
Yeah.
He thinks this really is helping the greater good to some extent. Maria Conchita Alonso, who plays Amber, just happened to be the girl that they cast in this role.
She's also in Predator 2.
Oh, another.
So, Arnold wasn't in the second one,
but he was still in the first one.
And so they both have faced the Predator.
I assume that she had some kind of a contract with a modeling agency, and this became the next thing that she was in. They don't do a very good job writing her at all. She's the damsel in distress for a majority of this movie.
She does have some kick-ass moments, but she's the love interest.
Yep, they're few and far between.
Yeah. When
it boils down to it. And also, I don't feel like there's a real romance going on here.
The romance is very forced.
You could have made her a character who tattles on Schwarzenegger and gets him sent away, and then really has this moral this moral decision to make because she sees that they did fake that footage. You see this and you go, she's like, oh, I was wrong. And then she breaks into ICS.
She hides the disc in her bra.
Whereas, wouldn't it have been better if maybe she all of a sudden saw this and then everything else starts to make more sense? You don't realize that you're being tricked until your eyes are open. And so if she had a bigger part in this and, she tries harder to get him to be, for him to be innocent, it would be better.
Yeah.
I think. Also, the fact that the role they gave her at ICS is like, well, I composed the music.
Yeah.
That's it.
And this takes place in 2019.
2019.
We're way more progressive.
Do you realize that there are two people in this who would, within 2 decades, become the governors of 2 different states?
Jesse Ventura
in Minnesota and Arnold Schwarzenegger in California.
Who also, both of them were in Predator.
Right.
So there's 3 people in this movie that faced against the Predator.
I feel like there's another person, too. I feel like there's one more Predator
I think you're right.
connection somewhere. And it'll take me a minute to find it.
It might be Weiss.
Oh, it's Sven Ole Thorsen appeared in Predator, and he played the character Sven. Do you know what I'm talking about?
One?
Well, no, in this he's played Sven Ole Thorsen,
Okay.
but his character name was Sven.
Okay.
But he was also in the Predator.
Okay.
As well. So yeah, so you got a bunch of people who are all fighting aliens as well.
And back in the 80s.
Whereas
like nowadays, well, there's a lot of people that have seen the Alien and the Predator and
Mick Fleetwood playing a character named Mick. It is ambiguous as to whether or not he's actually playing himself, Mick Fleetwood, because they have allusions to songs like, oh, you arrested all my friends and burned my songs, or what's going on. And then Dweezil Zappa, son of Frank Zappa, in this thing as well. Jim Brown, who plays Fireball, you might recognize him from the movie Mars Attacks from the late 90s. He plays the like a boxer. He's perfect. Jim Brown's one of those guys who I like in movies.
Yeah.
And he shows up from time to time, and it'll be in things like The Running Man, Mars Attacks. He had a role in Any Given Sunday, The Dirty Dozen.
Of all the stalkers, I think Fireball is probably my favorite because he doesn't seem as hokey. He actually comes in and he seems pretty badass. It's like, hey, they throw some gas or something on the floor and then it explodes in front of him and he just walks right on through it and he actually talks to them and he seems like he's the biggest villain. Yeah. If I could go back of the stalkers. Right. The other ones are just kind of campy and hokey.
If I could go back and change something about this movie, one of the things I would change is the Richard Dawson character would have been like the Jesse Ventura one, where he's the host, but he's also a retired enforcer. And so he has to go out, he has to redon his stuff for the first time in 10 years. So as this movie progresses it's really cast with, other than Schwarzenegger and Richard Dawson, in my opinion, people who could just fill the role anywhere. Right. Tanaka, who plays Sub-Zero, he gets hidden behind a mask for most of the time. And you don't really get the sense in this movie that they're pushing these guys, that these are the biggest celebrities. These are the biggest sports stars in America.
Buzzsaw lifts his motorcycle.
Right.
Ooh.
And, you're not seeing people wearing shirts, with Buzzsaw on them. Yeah. And where are the kids, with little dolls? Where's the fake commercial in this thing that's like, hey, pick up your Sub-Zero with new hockey action?
I mean, they do have the, hey, you get the Running Man home game with the for the winners. But you don't.
Even at this time, commercialism is so huge that they should have really thought that. Now, this is, again, where I come from. This is this is where the director is a bad choice. So this guy's used to shooting stuff for TV. Yep. He had a horrible vision of what the future should have looked like. Yeah.
Especially with the commercialism.
Right. And the thing is, there's so much from the Stephen King material that is very Nostradamus-like, because he talks about how popular reality television is. At this point, reality television really isn't a thing. You've got stuff where they're to do-it-yourself shows
or documentaries.
Yep, but there's nothing like we see today.
Hey, you're watching somebody just live.
Right. And I mean, this movie was so popular, it spawned the idea for American Gladiators.
Yeah. There are two other things within this movie that are not cast that are very interesting things.
What's that?
The choreographer, Paula Abdul.
Really?
Yeah.
Because it starts off, the show itself, the show within the movie, like starts off with the dancers.
Bunch of dancers, and they're dancing. They're like getting really close to Ben Richards as he's walking up the ramp and everything like that. And there's a lot of dancing in the movie. And yeah, Paula Abdul was the choreographer.
Something that I found interesting about this, which is so you've got Paula Abdul doing some choreography here, but to me, the show itself had an odd feel in the fact that they had it in front of a studio audience, and so much of it takes place inside the studio.
Yeah.
I mean, other than the first 20 minutes, everything else takes place within the studio and then the arena that they've set up, which is connected in my mind to the studio space.
It seems like the arena is just a huge swath of city that is maybe fenced off or something.
Right.
It doesn't look like, hey, this is all indoors. It looks like it's just part of a rundown city.
I would have liked to have seen more parts of the studio as a piece of this thing.
Well, they do have that little part where they're walking through hallways and he's like jabs the pen in the back.
Yeah, but I mean, to me, is the television aspect of this should have been a character, right? That's the voyeurism that we're getting into with the Running Man, is that's what people are yearning for, is they want to see this carnage.
Yep.
And so this television studio, to me, should have been the thing that portrays, okay, it's only for the ultra rich to be here at the studio. It is, the people who are working here are practically slave labor.
Yeah.
And I would have liked to have seen more aspects of that. And I think that is a problem that this director ran into, is that he didn't have a fully realized picture of what this place is looking like.
He was going off of, hey, this is what an action movie is nowadays,
right,
in the 80s.
Yep.
To go along with that, John Parr does that 80s rock theme at the very end of the movie, who is well known for St. Elmo's Fire. And it sounds just like the Man in Motion. St. Elmo's Fire song. Like, in fact, when I was watching it, and I was like, this sounds like Man in Motion. And I looked it up. Sure enough, John Parr.
I had to look into this, but the dance, the Running Man.
Oh, yeah.
Are you familiar with that? No connection whatsoever.
Nope.
Between these two, even though it became super popular in late 86, early 87. So leading up to the release of this movie, Janet Jackson really got everyone going because it was part of her video with Rhythm Nation. And the original dance is known as the Hungry Caterpillar. And so,
the closest I would say is like when hey, this is the show, and you see like in the beginning credits where you see like an animated look of Arnold Schwarzenegger running.
Right.
It's not moving. Maybe that's where they got the dance from.
We'll see. We'll see. I mean, the movie itself didn't come out until November. So either someone saw some early cuts of the animatics, or they moved on from there. Okay, let's talk a little bit. We're touching on the set for this movie. The set is dystopian future.
Yep.
They do an interesting job with just things that take place outside, because it looks outside. It doesn't really look super futuristic.
No. There's a very distinction between, hey, this is run down, and then this is nice. Like the airport looks nice.
Right.
Everything else is crappy.
But the airport's not full of interesting technology.
No.
It's when they get up to like the TSA thing. But I think, and remind me if I'm wrong, they're just looking for facial recognition, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
When Ben escapes, they've got these collars on, and the collars are going to make your head explode.
Yep.
And we see some head exploding right away in the beginning of this movie.
Gotta have the head explode. It's an 80s action flick.
And so those were some of the futuristic ideas, which is everyone carries around a laptop and everyone's got, something that they're going to beam in at some point. And
the fact that buying a Pepsi is like $3.
Yeah. I mean, they started to get to the right spot. So that's where I think when you look at the Stephen King adaptation, he predicted a lot of stuff that turned out to be correct.
Yeah.
The visual aspect that they put into this movie really dates it. So, for example, when you see who's the one which one of the enforcers is driving a car, like a car?
Dynamo.
The car is...
It's like a go-kart. Makes you think that you're playing Mario Kart.
Right, yeah. It's odd angles, and it just doesn't feel right in any way, shape, or form. I just don't get the point behind it. But that being said, the dystopian aspect, I think, of this movie led to other dystopian styles. So, for example, Demolition Man with Sylvester Stallone and Wesley Snipes, I think, has a very similar look to The Running Man. And what they did for...
everything is nice and happy up on top, but underneath, people are eating rat burgers.
Right. And just the everything's kind of dark and everything's dirty. And, at one point there were riots and no one ever cleaned up after a riot. So what happens to an urban setting?
I mean, you had futuristic stuff like Alien had come out, but that was more science fiction-y horror
and outer space.
And coming back to Earth, it wasn't a dystopian future. It just was what it was.
Right.
Whereas this was an actual dystopian futuristic idea, and I'm having troubles trying to think. Well, I suppose, there's some older ones like Logan's Run and Soylent Green and Planet of the Apes, but...
And even take Soylent Green, costuming was a big part of that. The costuming here dates this more than any other aspect.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not even just the fact that when you're in the Running Man competition, they put you in a single piece onesie, but even the dresses the women are wearing in the studio audience.
They all seem very 80s, despite the fact that it's supposed to be the future. Now, it's impossible to predict where fashion is going to go, but everything, women were wearing shoulder pads in their suits.
But take a leap for it, right? We're already suspending disbelief that this is going on. So why couldn't we believe that at that point? Here's an example, like I was talking about, where the wealthy, the difference between the wealthy class and the working class. What if the working class, they all had to wear single color jumpsuits? And if you had actual clothes and fashion, that meant that you were wealthy. So everyone who's in the studio audience can wear a suit with a tie or, a turtleneck or something like that. But then everyone who's working there has to wear sort of this utilitarian jumpsuit.
Now, legitimately, all of that would have been minor detail. The point of the movie was to, hey, Arnold Schwarzenegger running around with people trying to kill him.
Right. But is that the point? I mean, really, what do you think King is commenting on here?
Stephen King?
Yeah, what do you think the point of The Running Man is? Because my feeling is it's how media controls their story. How you can be lied to by mass media.
And whether the audience wants to be lied to because they want to be entertained.
Right, exactly. And so, that idea of what is entertainment? When does entertainment become news? And where are you blurring the line between those two things? Because
news is entertainment, and if you think about it,
the book itself, is it a pretty lengthy book?
It's not super long. It's probably one of his shorter full length books, and it takes place a little farther into the future. It actually takes place in 2025. It is still kind of dystopian, but the idea behind it is way more broad. So Richards is an unemployed, impoverished resident. He volunteers for the Running Man to earn money for his family. Richards is labeled an enemy of the way that the Running Man works in the book. The volunteer, Richards, is labeled an enemy of the state and is able to go anywhere in the world, earning $100 for every hour he stays alive, with bonuses for killing law enforcement. He's given some cash and a video camera so that he can record himself for proof of life. And he gets a 12-hour head start before the hunters look for him. They're not called stalkers in the book. They're called hunters. There is an underground movement similar to the movie. Richards tries to broadcast it. Tries to broadcast that there's an underground movement in his video, but that video is overdubbed. So that information doesn't get out to the mass. Richards breaks the longest record. Eventually, he hijacks a plane, and then Killian offers to make him a hunter, similar in the movie. Killian says Richards' family was killed, though. So all of that, the reason why he volunteered was so that his family can have money so that they can live. But Killian says that they're dead, and so they've been dead for a while. Richards then kills the bad hostages, like the bad guys that are on this plane, but is wounded. He lets the innocent hostage people parachute out, and then he flies the plane into the Game Network tower.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. So, obviously, being a Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, you can't have the good guy die at the end, whereas in the book he does die. But it's all I would say that the book almost seems a little more realistic to what it seems like today than what the movie is.
It is. I mean, it's very
also with the 9/11 idea thing, where it flies a plane into to kill the evil.
And also just the changing of information, like
the overdubs, because I believe in the book, it's not just overdubbed. I mean, it's like he's trying to send this message, and when he actually hears it when it's broadcast, he's just swearing and cursing.
So obviously they really changed the movie to take place in 2017 because it's 30 years in the future from this.
Exactly. To make it a nice, easy round number.
Which it's almost too bad they didn't say like the beginning pieces were in 85 and then the actual, Running Man portion of it was in 87. So then it's a full 30 or in 2017, excuse me. So like 2015 and then 2017. So that the bulk of the movie takes place 30 years in the future, because really the bulk takes place 32 years into the future from the release date.
I feel like movies nowadays, they try to jump forward even more so, because back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, just saying 30 years into the future it seemed very viable and like, hey, look at all this technology that's going to come about. And when you actually get to it nowadays and you look at it back, you're like, man, they were dumb on some aspects.
Right. And you can't obviously perfectly predict the future, right?
Impossible. But nowadays they try to jump it even farther so that the cool technology looks even possible.
I want to take a quick moment and talk about Kurt Fuller for a second. So Kurt Fuller is one of the people in the control room for who you might recognize from like Wayne's World, where he plays almost the exact same role as a television technician who's putting together the show Wayne's World. If you were to gauge this movie 1 out of 10, what would you give it?
If it was back in the 80s, comparing to other movies that were of the same caliber, probably a 5. But looking at it now, I mean, I would give it more like maybe like a 6.5, just because the nostalgia that comes along with it. And instead of, hey, I got to watch 5 Arnold Schwarzenegger movies to catch some interesting one-liners and interesting stuff like that, instead of watching 5 of them, you could just watch this one and you get all of that.
I am of the opinion that this movie does get better with age.
It definitely does.
It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. This movie is begging for a remake.
Oh, absolutely.
Without a doubt.
Although I wonder if studios would be hard pressed on how to make it specifically. Yeah. Because, I mean, they've remade a bunch of those 80 action flicks like Total Recall and RoboCop, and they haven't done a good job with it. So would they try to remake this as hey, this is a Stephen King story, or are they going to try to remake it as an Arnold Schwarzenegger action flick?
Interesting. Yeah. Because I feel like today's audience would look at this and say, like, there are a lot of parallels to where we are right now as a society. And so my opinion of it changes. I remember watching this on VHS. I remember having to get an older cousin to rent it for me because it's a very hard R.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember watching it as a kid and enjoying it and liking it because I was little and I liked explosions.
Yeah.
And like, wow, look at that.
Same here.
But today, it leaves a different taste in my mouth. Now, the acting is horrible.
Yeah.
The sets and the costuming will make you cringe a little bit, but it seems like it's a time capsule to what they thought the 2000 teens were going to be in the 80s, as well as the social change that we're experiencing right now.
It was definitely fun to rewatch when I watched it. And just like with you, there were some like cringeworthy moments in there where it's like, come on. But I still really enjoyed it. And I wrote down some of the one-liners that Arnold says. Yeah. So I got to read some. Some of the one-liners was give you a lift. Of course, he says, I'll be back. And of course, everything has to do. It's like he's throwing somebody off of
They're all
balcony.
puns, right?
They're all very puns.
You're like, enjoy the flight.
He's a real pain in the neck. And it's like he killed somebody in the neck. Buzzsaw, it's like he takes his chainsaw and he like cuts him in half. And when somebody asks him about it, he's like, oh, he had to split. To Fireball, he goes, what a hothead. Yeah,
you have to wonder, like, what is in the screenplay and what are the things where, okay, everyone, I am Arnold Schwarzenegger. If anyone comes up with a good idea for a line, please tell me, and I will include it in the movie.
Hey, he's gonna cut this guy in half. We should say he had to split.
Yeah, that's a cut. So I think that there's plenty of stuff there. It's a lot of fun.
It's definitely an enjoyable watch, but watch it for the nostalgia factor and to go, hey, this was an 80s, because it really does kind of encapsulate like all of the kind of Arnold Schwarzenegger type movies that you might want to watch. There are better ones out there to watch, but if you want like a big gamut of, hey, this was an 80s action flick, it's a good one to watch for that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about how it did.
Okay.
Movie was made for $27 million, grossed $38 million, which is
profit.
It's a success. In the 80s, like, that is the type of thing that is a success. As I mentioned earlier, this movie was the inspiration for American Gladiators. So that's pretty massive.
And that became a big thing too.
Big thing. There was also, I can't remember the name of the video game, but it spawned a video game where it's pretty much like the Running Man and Smash TV is an arcade game.
Oh, sure.
From 1990. This movie, I think people talk about it. I mean, people still today will talk about the Schwarzenegger movies of the 80s, and the Running Man is on that list. When it's not at the top of a lot of lists, but it's there.
When the Hunger Games came out, people were like, oh, it's the Running Man with teenagers.
Yep, exactly. And if you don't think that the Hunger Games was influenced by this idea.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people also said, oh, it's just like Battle Royale, but that's a Japanese movie, so not as many people were familiar with that movie compared to a lot of people knew about The Running Man.
As far as I know, no talk for a sequel to it, which it kind of surprised me. You would think that at one point there would have been a sequel, but this is also one where it wraps up, right? Yeah. He shows them that the villains are out there and the villains are mass media, and he also takes care of Richard Dawson's character.
There was a lot of Arnold Schwarzenegger movies that were just a one-off action flick. You got, Predator had its own thing, but you had Commando was its own thing.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of another single.
What's the Eraser? Eraser was a one-off. Last Action Hero was a one-off.
Yeah, they're out there.
Yeah.
One thing that I really appreciate from this whole thing is the fact that I haven't heard of a remake for it yet, but I do think this thing is primed for a remake.
I feel like there was talk about possibly doing one, but then Hunger Games came out, and so it might have gotten waylaid.
People like an R-rated Hunger Games, wouldn't they?
You think?
You don't think? HBO Pictures was one of the production companies behind this thing. And so this is a time, too, when HBO was trying to really get their footing in there. So I think, it's got a Blu-ray release. It's something that people, I think, are enjoying and still talk about. So could we see in fact, let's flip the script, right? What if Arnold Schwarzenegger played Damon Killian in the next one?
He could.
Yeah, and you had some kind of like a nerdier person who gets thrown into this.
And he uses his brain. Well, then you really are kind of talking about the Hunger Games.
Yeah, that's true. But it's rated R, right?
Yeah,
There'll still be
rated R.
chainsaw arms and
the person who's put in there is more of an everyday person, kind of like what he's supposed to be in the actual novel. He's just an everyday schmo. Whereas, you look at Arnold Schwarzenegger and it's like
big and beefy.
Man.
Yeah. It's like when they tried to make him seem like he sold computers and True Lies, be like, someone who's got a chest like that is not selling computers. Yeah. They're working out all the time. All right, so Phil, as we wrap up this conversation on Men Among Kings about the 1987 Arnold Schwarzenegger starring The Running Man, yes or no? You think people should watch this?
I definitely think so. But of course, watch it for what it is comparatively to the book. It's not. It's like I said at the beginning. It's got the idea behind it, but the plot is definitely different from the book. So if you're going to read the book, be aware that it is not the same as the movie.
Which first, movie or book? If you're going to consume
movie,
them?
Because it's going to be easier, faster to watch.
Well, I'm just thinking, like, if you're planning on doing both, which are you going to consume first? Should
watch
you read the movie or watch the movie first and then read the book?
Yeah, watch the movie first.
Interesting. I'm going to give this a middle of the ground. If you see this is on your on-demand and you're sitting at home alone one night, you could do a lot worse.
Yeah.
I don't think that you're going to want to sit down after a Thanksgiving meal and watch this with your whole family.
No.
You can save that for a Peanuts Snoopy retrospective. But it definitely isn't the worst of the Stephen King adaptations.
Not at all.
It is on the lower tier, but it is not the worst.
As an adaptation, not super great, but as a movie itself, okay.
And how often do action movies get better with age?
I know.
It's odd, especially an action movie from the 80s getting better with age.
I know.
All right. Signing off for this episode of Men Among Kings, I'm JJ.
I'm Phil.